Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Mauricio Rodríguez, profesor de liderazgo de la Universidad Externado de Colombia. Estamos hoy en la universidad con un visitante ilustre. Tenemos el honor y el privilegio de contar con la presencia de Sir Ken Robinson, una de las personas que más impacto ha causado en el mundo educativo, específicamente en materia de creatividad. Su charla TED ha sido vista por más de 46 millones de personas y me comentaba ahora Sir Ken que posiblemente la han visto en la práctica 10 veces esa cantidad, o sea, 500 millones de personas, porque se ha replicado en muchos medios universitarios, académicos, periodísticos. Es un gran debate sobre la calidad de la educación y en particular sobre cómo estimular la creatividad, cómo evitar que los niños a lo largo del proceso educativo pierdan el interés en la creatividad. Entonces, sin más preámbulos, vamos a una conversación con Sir Ken. Voy a pasar a inglés para que podamos tener una conversación fluida. Sir Ken, welcome to Colombia. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to have you in our country.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and a privilege for me. Thank you very much.
We admire your academic work. It has inspired many changes in our country, and we hope to learn new things about your recent academic work so that we can continue making progress in Colombia. As you know, we are in a very important moment for our history, so your ideas are very welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm really delighted to hear that. Thank you.
My first question relates to education. We are here in this University Externado de Colombia, one of the most prestigious universities, and as teachers, as professors, we want to know how to encourage creativity, how to teach for creativity. And you mention in your writings 3 tasks that we must embrace: encouraging, identifying, and fostering. Could you please explain what is the essence of each of those tasks and how to do it, each of them in a proper way?
Okay. How long do I have? One of the issues for me is to define what creativity is. There are a lot of misconceptions about creativity. And as I see it, creativity is a set of capacities that we all have. We don't all develop them, but we have them. It's like not everybody is able to read and write, but almost everybody is capable of doing that if they learn what's involved. Only a very few people struggle with it, and there may be physical reasons for that, or sensory reasons. So creativity isn't a single thing, it's a suite of capacities. But it's a suite of capacities that really has made the difference between human beings and the rest of life on Earth. There's a reason why we're in a large building like this at a grand university with a prestigious history, surrounded by cameras and technology, and other creatures are not. It's not as if other animals are having their own conference somewhere else with their own technology. They're living pretty much as they always lived. And there are reasons why, culturally, human beings have accelerated so far ahead of the rest of life on Earth. Biologically, we haven't in most respects, but culturally we have. So it's important to define it, and I defined creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. And there's a prior term to that, which is imagination. Imagination, I think, is where this comes from. It's the capacity to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses. And we take it for granted as a capacity, but it's a really extraordinary set of abilities that we have, because with imagination you can step outside of your immediate sensory environment. You can revisit the past, you can anticipate the future, you can try to see things from somebody else's perspective, and from that grows probably the most defining ability we have, which is the capacity for symbolic thought, to have something represent something else, which underpins our capacity for language, for music, for art, for science, and the rest. So creativity is part of that complex of abilities, and it's the process of having original ideas that have value. It's different, as I see it, from imagination, in that You could be imaginative all day long and never do anything. You just lie in bed imagining. To be creative, you have to do something. It's a practical process. It can be anything, but it has to be something. It could be developing a new mathematical theorem. It could be developing a scientific hypothesis, a series of experiments. It could be composing a piece of music or playing it. I think of creativity as putting your imagination to work. It's the executive wing of imagination. It's like applied imagination. And the reason I say that is the way to understand, as I see it, how to encourage it is to understand how it works and to make it operational. I mean, for example, with literacy, we know quite a bit about what's involved in learning to read and write, and we can help people who can't do it to do it. We don't just hope they'll do it, we help them to do it. We explain and we give them practical exercises and we cultivate the abilities that are involved. So the first thing is that, it's to define it. The second is to recognize, when I say identify, that we all have these capacities and we have to help people understand that they do. The third is to, so the second then is to develop practical techniques of applying it. And that to me is a really important part of this, that you can't be creative if you don't have any control of the materials that you're using. I mean, for example, if you're painting, you have to use materials in order to do that. Creativity is often a very material process. It draws on skills, control of materials,
resources,
concepts and ideas, resources. Yeah, I mean, architects are creating ideas into material forms, and so they have to know a lot about how this material works and what its stress and strains are. Engineers do the same thing. It's the same if you're painting. You need to understand the material, and it's true actually conceptually with mathematics. You need to be able to understand mathematics in order to make it work. I remember Richard Feynman, the great physicist, once saying that if you want to understand quantum mechanics, you need mathematics. You can't do it without mathematics. I mean, you can't do it in poetry. And so you can't grasp it if you don't grasp the mathematics that's involved. And that's true. It's also true that if you want to tell somebody how much you love them, write them a poem. You know, don't give them an equation. Say, here, you work it out. You know, I don't know.
Of course.
So that's another part of it, is to recognize it's a material process that depends progressively on the evolution of skills and practical abilities.
Which are the main barriers, the main obstacles, and how to overcome them?
I think one of the barriers is, so to speak, ideological. There are misconceptions about creativity. I mean, for example, if you ask most adults if they're creative, they'll often tell you they're not. And one of the reasons is that people conflate creativity with artistry. They think
only artists are creative.
Yes,
everybody's creative.
That's right. When you say you're creative, what they hear you say is, are you artistic? By which they think you mean, do you play the guitar, do you sing, do you dance, are you a painter? Well, the arts are very important forms of creativity, but they're not the only form by any means. You can be just as creative in mathematics, in engineering and technology, and in fact anywhere that involves human intelligence is a scene of creative work. So there's that. It's getting people firstly to understand the range of creativity. A second misconception is that only special people are creative. That you know, there are, I mean, and people, like in all fields, some people are more naturally talented, and become more accomplished in some fields than others. But the idea that only certain people are creative is a bit like saying only certain people can learn to read and write. It's simply not true. And the third is there's nothing much you can do about it. You're either creative or you're not. And that's not true either. You can teach people to be more creative. So that's part of it. And the second is that those ideas are perpetuated in education very often. Children are not encouraged or helped or enabled to develop their creative capacities throughout the education system. And so they often come through education with those ideas reinforced.
I would like to explore your thoughts about the moral and ethical dilemmas related to creativity. In our country, unfortunately, we have plenty of creativity, lots of imagination, but they are used for wrong purposes, wrong objectives. Violence, narcotraffic, kidnappings, guerrillas, corruption. How do you make sure that this creativity is channeled properly towards positive objectives for society. It's a matter of principles and values and beliefs. How do you integrate these practical concepts about teaching creativity, but at the same time making sure that they are useful for society?
Well, you know, I think there's a good analogy with literacy. Literacy, reading and writing, in themselves are neutral capacities. Some people write beautiful poetry, inspirational philosophy, with their powers of literacy, and other people write hateful diatribes and stir up hostility and antagonisms between people. It's not literacy that's the problem, it's the mindset of the people who are putting these abilities to work. And creativity as a set of skills is neutral. But it's so the issue isn't about creativity so much, it's about ideology and ethics generally. And I mean, I define creativity as I say, as the process of having original ideas that have value. So in my conception, at any rate, and I'm not alone in thinking it, that the question of value is very important. I mean, I remember years ago, I wrote about it in a book, but years ago, one of my relatives came to our house, and he was very excited, and he said he'd come up with a brand new invention. And he said, it's going to make us all rich. And we said, well, great. We need this. What is it?
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, tell us all about it. And he said he'd seen this old lady walking down the street with a walking stick. And he said she kept having to pick it up, and it looked like a real problem. And he said, I thought if we put a wheel at the bottom of the stick, she could just push the stick along. And we thought, you know, it's not a bad idea, except for the one fatal mistake, which is she will kill herself the minute she goes out with it.
Of course.
So she'll just go over. So it was an original idea. It just wasn't any good. It wasn't appropriate to what he was trying to do. I mean, later on, of course, people developed 4 wheels. So that it was on the way to something. So when you're dealing with any creative process, I mean, and having original ideas is the hardest work that we do. Because our mind tends to run along habitual patterns. Breaking the mold, thinking differently, is the calling of creative work. But it often happens that people who come up with fresh ideas are misunderstood in their own times. People don't see the point of it. It happened with electricity. When Faraday was demonstrating electricity in the 19th century, people couldn't see the point of it because they didn't have dishwashers, they didn't have televisions, so they didn't need electricity. All that came afterwards. Somebody said to him, what use is it? He said, I don't know. What use is a baby? So part of being creative is making critical judgments about the value of what you're doing. And it happens at the micro level. You know, when you're writing a book, you're constantly thinking, is that right? Is that the right sentence? Did I say that properly? If you're composing music, it's like that. Mathematicians are the same. Does that feel right? So it's at the micro level, it's involved with critical judgments, but at the macro level, it's about, well, is this worthwhile? And many inventions have gone on to have consequences that were not foreseen. The motor car has led to more deaths in the 20th and 21st century than all of warfare put together and all forms of weaponry. But that wasn't the intention of Benz and Henry Ford when they developed the car. So there are always untold consequences. My real response to what you're saying is that you can't not encourage people to be creative because they might put their powers to bad use. What you also have to have in education is a strong sense of ethical understanding and values. We can't afford in our societies to have value-free education. We can't afford to not teach ethics in our schools. And if we see them both as connected, then our hope will always be that people will put these things to good use, not bad uses.
Thomas Alva Edison, the great inventor, said that success is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
Yeah.
In our case in Colombia, I feel, this is my personal opinion, that we have lots of imagination, we are creative people, but we are not innovators, really. When you look at the list of the most innovative countries in the world, Colombia doesn't show up in the first 70 or 80 positions. And that's because we dream a lot, we imagine a lot of things, we have even good ideas, but we don't have the discipline, the method, the process, the perseverance to transform that idea into a specific product or service, concrete material innovation. What would you suggest to Colombians to move ahead in this value chain of creativity, imagination, creativity, innovation, so that we just don't stop at having good ideas and make sure that we materialize those ideas?
Well, I mean, I bow to your expertise about the situation in Colombia, obviously, but generally speaking, you have to have an infrastructure in place for these ideas to take root. I mean, for example, there are lots of them, but I'm from England. Many of the ideas that inspired and drove the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries were not developed in England. Many of the most important ones came out of Scotland. But they took off in England. England became the crucible of the Industrial Revolution, not Scotland, even though a lot of the inventiveness was happening in Scotland. Yeah. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And the reason was that England at the time, not Britain as a whole, but England in particular, had a political system, a fiscal system, and a sense of entrepreneurship where ideas could be taken up, they could be invested in, and they could be taken up, and they could be promoted.
And top universities.
And top universities, exactly so. It was an intellectual hub and a capital and the political centre and a financial centre. So people took their ideas there for them to be developed and have people invest in them. And you need that. You need an infrastructure. Richard Florida wrote a very good book a number of years ago called The Rise of the Creative Class. Mm-hmm. And in it, he looked at the conditions in cities that gave rise to innovation. Mm-hmm. I was involved a number of years ago now with Singapore. Mm-hmm. Singapore wanted, this is I think probably 20 years ago, to become the creative hub of Southeast Asia. And to a lot of people at the time, it didn't seem very probable. But if you go to Singapore now, you'll see an extraordinary difference in the city. Mm-hmm. At the time, and for a long time, it had been dependent on the infrastructure of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And it has no natural resources. It's not really a country as we understand it, it's a city-state. Mm-hmm. But it has no natural resource to speak of. Mm-hmm. Its gas all comes from the mainland and the electricity. It depends entirely on this umbilical connection to Indonesia. And they realized that they had to develop the powers of the people if it was to thrive as an independent centre. And I was one of a number of people who went to advise them on that. And I remember saying to them that there is if you think of creativity and innovation, I mean, I think of creativity as putting your imagination to work, mm-hmm. and innovation as putting good ideas into practice.
Exactly.
So in Singapore at the time, there was no real infrastructure for that. And I was saying there's a distinction to be made between the psychology of creativity, by which I mean how do you help people as individuals and as groups to generate ideas? How does that process work? And we know a lot about that, mm-hmm. and we can help people individually and collaboratively to do that. But there's also a sociology of creativity, which is to say, why do some places become hubs and other places don't? And that's what Richard Florida was writing about. You know, why London in the 19th century? Why Paris in the 1920s? Why Silicon Valley in the 1970s? What was going on there? Well, in Silicon Valley, which has become, you know, the epicenter of the digital revolution, there were social conditions, cultural conditions. It attracted people who were thinking freely. It was California. And there were cultural conditions that drew people in. There was a high tolerance of people with different ideologies, different personal identities, different social affiliations. So it wasn't a restrictive culture. And there were several major universities there who were prepared to invest in it, and people who were drawn to invest as a consequence. So there were particular conditions there that made good ideas take root there, not in Alabama, even though there are plenty of people in Alabama with the capacity for innovation. So I think part of what you need to think about, I'm sure you are thinking about it, just as you asked me the question, in Colombia, is what sort of infrastructure, what sort of patterns of investment, what sort of programs in this university.
The environment, the atmosphere.
What cultural and economic environment could you move towards here that will attract, not only encourage the people here to believe their ideas have a chance of being developed, but will attract other people to come and say, well, actually, Bogota is the place to be at the moment. You know, this is where it's happening. And that's what Singapore set out to do, and Singapore has become one of the creative hubs of Southeast Asia. It's a great banking centre now. It's not only a tourist centre, but there are lots of infrastructure things happening there. There's a lot of that going on in the Middle East, but they have a head start in a way because they have massive resources to invest in their own infrastructure. But I think it's looking at the sociology and the economic and political conditions in which innovation takes root in a city, that's the next challenge. But you should never doubt that the talent is here. It's obviously here.
Sir Ken, thank you very much for your wonderful ideas. Congratulations. And thank you very much for your specific advice to Colombia. We'll make sure that your ideas are put in practice in our country.
My great pleasure. Thank you so much, Mauricio. Thank you.
Un aplauso para Sir Ken.